There's nobody online but us, but that's okay. Not even Bobby could take minutes. I don't know how she thinks she's gonna get minutes. Okay, we're gonna get started. If Carly would like to have a seat and others would like to have a seat. I'm not sure where Carol is. She's the one bringing the food, so hopefully she shows up pretty soon. So we have that for when the program starts. I'm going to call us to order and get started. So welcome to our LHS members and to guests. Welcome also to our special guest speaker who will be introduced later by Robert. Today is March 28th. As those who are members know, March 31st is our deadline for membership renewal. So we can take cash, checks, e-transfer, etc. So if you are looking to renew your membership, please do so tonight or by phone or by email or website with HSA, Historical Society of Alberta. I have the minutes from January 24th and February 28th. Bobby has prepared those and presented those. If anybody would like to read them, I have them here. Essentially, it's exactly what you would expect. We talked about in both of them the special resolution to amend the objectives of the society, which was passed at our last meeting. We talked about the donations we gave to the Historical Society of Alberta grant, as well as to the Public Library and the Galt Museum. And we talked about how Reflections is going. Reflections will be moving forward. It's had one complete setup and it's being reviewed and edited now as we move ahead. We are still hoping that we will have Reflections by the summer, and those are from the January and February meeting minutes. So can I get a motion to adopt the minutes from January and February? All right, I've got Carly who is moving it, George who is seconded, all members who are okay with adopting the minutes, perfect. Book committee report, like I said, I'm not sure where Carol is. So book committee, I've already mentioned the Reflections book. Membership committee, Nicole could not make it today, but she also just wanted to send a reminder about the membership year is ending March 31st, so please renew. Special resolution, this is going to be voted on in April. As per our bylaw, it has already been announced once. It's in the March newsletter, and I will give it again, but we won't be voting on this until the April meeting. So what this is to move the year end for LHS. So the existing bylaw of the society dated 2014 notes that the fiscal year of the society shall be from 1st November of one year to 31st October of the next year. The LHS executive recommends that this be amended to, can you tell what minutes I was doing earlier? The LHS executive recommends that this be amended to the fiscal year of the society shall be from 1st October of one year to 30th September of the next year. Again, that is just for information at this point as we move ahead. Announcements. We were able to get one of the Crook grants, it's not exactly the right word, from the University of Lethbridge. So we will be hiring a half-time student at $20 per hour for 20 hours of work for 16 weeks throughout the summer. So if you know a history researcher, an oral historian, somebody who's in the history program at the university, please let them know about that job opportunity. We will have them working on an oral history project, following up on one of our research projects that we've been working on. So they will be working with the LHS executive on a couple of research projects doing oral history research for us this summer. And that is completely paid for by the University of Lethbridge. So we get a half-time student at no cost to us. But now we just need to find the right student. So please let them know. If you are looking for a volunteer opportunity, the Historical Society of Alberta, our provincial organization, is looking for a vice president. So if you have a name to recommend, please let me know, or you can speak to Tim Mary, the past president of the Historical Society of Alberta, directly. We need somebody who can really understand board governance and is willing to be in the queue to move on to president. That's where we are right now, is we have a vice president who doesn't wish to be president. So we'll be stepping away and we're looking for another vice president. As some of you know, we've been doing booths at various organizations. We were at the vinyl record sale here at the Public Library on Saturday. We were at a few others as well. And we are looking to move ahead. with different booths, and we'll be at the Playgoer Centennial, April 20th to 21st. That is a Friday evening and a long day on Saturday. It goes till 10 o'clock at night on Saturday. So if you are wanting to volunteer at the booth, or if you just want to attend, it is absolutely free. We'll also be doing some 5-minute presentations on local history at that event as well. So lots of things are coming up. We are working to get right now to try to get a booth at Farmers Market and a few others. So if you know of any booths that the LHS could be at, please make sure you let us know as we move ahead, because we're trying to get out there as much as possible with, not only just on social media, but in person as well. Those are all the announcements I have. Does anyone else have anything that I've missed? Yes, Carly.
Just volunteer person for $20 an hour or something. Is that at the university?
No, they will be paying for it, but the person will be working with us. So they'll either be working out of their home or out of our office or something like that. But they will be working directly with the LHS. We applied for it, we put in an expression of interest, and we were one of the 6 groups that was chosen to get one of these for the summer. So, yeah. So, yes, as I said, please let any university, it is the university, so it has to be a U of L student in their undergraduate degree that we'll be looking for. Hopefully somebody, as I said, who has research background and oral history background. Any other questions or concerns or anything anybody wants to bring up? It is something about Love Your Cat Day today, but just in case you guys are curious. All right. I will then adjourn us, and that is our meeting, and we will move on. Lorian is off in Las Vegas today. That's why she's not here going to be introducing. So Robert has graciously agreed to introduce our guest speaker and move us into our program. So Robert, I'll hand the microphone over to you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I apologize in advance. I probably won't do this as well as Lorian does, but I will try. So our speaker tonight is Barry Adams. Barry is a graduate of the University of Alberta, and he served for 38 years with Alberta Environment and Parks, along with the many iterations of that name. As a provincial rangelands specialist, assisting ranchers to apply the principles and practices of rangeland management to promote healthy rangelands and sustainable livestock operations. Since leaving the government of Alberta, Barry has worked with an interdisciplinary team on a series of First Nations lands claims throughout the Prairie region. He is also active with the Society for Range Management and is on the board of Plateau Perspectives, a charity that focuses on grassland conservation and human wellness amongst nomadic communities in Central Asia. Barry and his wife Allison have made Lethbridge their home here since 1984. And he will be presenting tonight on the history of prairie rangeland management and rangeland science. So please help me in welcoming Barry Adams up to the stage. Share the screen. I want to get your presentation up there, I think, if we can, versus looking at you. No, that's not right. Screen share screen. Yeah, share the screen. There we go. And then give me the you want the full one there? Yeah, so I can see my notes. Awesome.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Robert. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak this evening. Let's get myself organized here. one of the little stories I wanted to start off with is just to talk about how fragile our historical records can be. And the message I'm sharing with you tonight actually started working on this back in 2002 when I was working on a sage-grouse recovery plan. Ron McNeil at the back here was part of that group as a geologist, surficial geologist. One of the challenges working as a rangeland management specialist and working with a group of biologists, I was trying to convey the landscape that people were looking at today, because there was kind of an underlying belief that perhaps the reason that sage-grouse were having so much trouble was perhaps because the range was overgrazed, overutilized, that sort of thing. And fortunately, I still had a reference on my bookshelf that I had. This is a document published in 1941. It's called the Grazing Rates Report, Shortgrass Area of Alberta. I started my career off in Edmonton before I came here in '84. And one day I was coming out of Petroleum Plaza near the legislature, and somebody was dumping a box of books in the garbage. And I said, you know, what have you got there? And I reached in and I pulled out one of these. And it sat on my bookshelf for years. And about 2000, I finally cracked the cover on it and went through this review that had been prepared by a fellow he was called the grazing appraiser with Lands and Forests, a fellow named Graham Anderson. And I was astonished at the things that I'd learned, things that I'd never picked up through school or through any of my working experience. And so some of my presentation this evening is going to be the information that came out of this document. At one time, there were only 3 copies of this left in the province, and happily now it's scanned and it's available on the web. So anyway, my old professor from the University of Alberta, Dr. Bailey, said that range management is both art and science. And we look back over the past century, we see leadership in the ranching community. And that's a big part of what I want to focus on today is the influence that ranchers have had in the development not only of practices, but also of the science that supports range management today. I'd like to tell a series of stories starting about 1881 and eventually bringing us into the present day. I'd like to highlight how people on the land have interacted effectively with scientists and policymakers for the betterment of rangeland management. My central question is this: early rangeland lessons, are 100-year-old learnings still relevant today, including perspectives for ranchers, science, and policy? And for a group of historians, that should be a compelling title for the evening, I would hope. See if I can get this thing working. So I think this audience will be well acquainted with what native grassland is, but just to set the stage. Here at Lethbridge, we sit at the northern limit of the once vast North American prairie. And this landscape was defined by historic aridity, fire, grazing by large herbivores like bison, and it had, which of course had a limiting effect on the growth of woody species. Vegetation is dominated by grasses, forbs, which are herbaceous plants, low shrubs. Trees and tall shrubs are restricted to riparian areas, drainages, that sort of thing. And native biodiversity evolved with grazing of native herbivores, including bison, elk, bighorn sheep, and have persisted and coexisted with ranching for more than 130 years. And here's just an example of, here's a map actually that Ron developed for me about more than 20 years ago, Ron. And just showing the variety of different native grassland types with the dry rangelands along your right side of the screen, Bormesic grasslands in the foothills around the left side. Here's a graphic representation of the areas that we sort of think of as being native or native-like vegetation. In green, grassland in the light green, and forest cover in the foothills region in the darker green. And the areas in white are areas that are largely cultivated. So one of the first places we can start is to reflect on some wisdom from a Blackfoot elder, Wilfred Yellowwing. Wilfred lives just off the highway at Scott's Coulee. As you make the little bend there at Scott's Coulee, Wilfred lives just to the south side of the highway. And I was giving a little workshop one day with ranchers from the Piikani First Nation, and I was sharing the message there with Wilfred, and I was pleased that he and I were both on the same page. And so one of the first bits of wisdom or understanding about how grazing fits into the prairie landscape is that Wilfred talked about the fact that grazing was not a constant on the landscape. Grazing animals were nomadic. After there was grazing, there were periods of rest. And in the lower right, you see a map there that shows this was compiled by an author named Epp, anthropologist, archaeologist type. And what it shows is the kind of what our understanding is of how the big bison herds interacted with the landscape. Moving to the plains during the spring and summer months, and then moving back to the foothills in the parkland during the winter months to take advantage of abundant forage. Over thousands of years, bison migrated between plains, parkland, and foothills, driven by cycles of season, drought, predators, and the influence of indigenous people. And that probably included things like their use of fire. Now, this was really an interesting thing. My eyes were opened to this, to these glacial erratics. And again, this is something that you've studied, Ron. The trail, the Boulder Trail. This rock on the Piikani First Nation is related to Okotoks. It was deposited on the prairie landscape. What, about 12,000 years ago, Ron? That'd be about time. It was carried on a conveyor belt from. They believe some of this rock came from Mount Edith Cavell. It was deposited on the Cordilleran Glacier and transported like a conveyor belt, and then deposited as the glaciers melted out. Craig Wood there, he's a soils guy. He used to work for PFRA. He's passed away some years ago, but he's giving us a little lesson about this rock because it sits in the landscape in a perfect funnel. The corners of the rock have been polished by thousands of years of bison rubbing on that rock. And as the bison would come and denude the soil around that rock, wind and water would carry the soil away, and through time, that rock has sunk into the prairie. So it's kind of evidence of Wilfred's basic assertion that grazing wasn't a constant. Here's a bit of proof of the migratory habits of bison. So we're going to move to the United States here for a minute. We're just going to reflect on what happened south of the border before we look at what happened here in Canada. The rangelands of the Western US were used for free range grazing for many decades, with the public domain not coming under any regulatory control until 1898. And that's actually about 10 years after the Dominion of Canada actually started to actually deliver a regulation of grazing on public lands here in Canada. And you see the 11 Western states there, and the rangeland areas are depicted, I think they're in yellow. The growth of the cattle industry in the northern and central Great Plains began about the 1870s after the Civil War. Most of the cattle used for the base herds in the plains area came from Texas. By the mid-1880s, cattle had reached peak numbers on most western ranges, and range exploitation was at a maximum, followed by some, whoops, trying to see my notes here. Followed by some dramatic losses in livestock due to drought, bad winters, and starvation. Also, there was considerable conflict between cattlemen and sheepmen in the 1890s and early 1900s. The sheepmen were mobile, the cattlemen were not, and so often the ranges would get a double grazing treatment. Part of this demand was driven by the scarcity of farmland, resulting in a shift in focus to livestock production. Federal lands became grazing commons. Think of the tragedy of the commons. Between 1880 and 1910, there was a great reduction in the rangeland resource as landscapes became cultivated, same as they were here in Canada. This reduction was caused by overgrazing and the conversion of rangeland to farmland. And at this point, the poor management of the nation's rangelands started to become an issue. And eventually in the US, something called the Taylor Grazing Act would come into effect, but not until 1934. But that's another story. That's another presentation. And just even by the 1930s, I'm not sure how these estimates were done, but the general picture was that 93% of the western rangelands were in a declining state. I heard this story that I'm going to tell you right now at a conference in 1998 from a plant scientist named Stubendijk, and sadly, he never published it. So I'm sort of piecing it together from what I was able to dig up and from my own memory. So anyway, this is a story I heard in 1998 at a conference in Nebraska. So as the western rangelands in the United States, as their condition cratered, those trends were being noticed, and we started to see a response from the science world. The University of Nebraska at Lincoln has a long history of being a leader in the study of rangeland and prairie ecology and management. A number of pioneers in rangeland ecology were educated and conducted research at the University of Nebraska. And one of the forums was this thing called the Botanical Seminar, the Bessie Seminar or system. And this was a gathering of Dr. Bessie's graduate students, and they were grappling with these problems that were coming to them from people on the land. So we learned that Bessie's priority with his students was influenced by what was happening out on the landscape. People were asking questions. As we'll see here in Canada as well, a lot of our practices were guided by what was done in the old country, and things like range science were yet to be developed. Two really big names that came through the University of Nebraska as students and then as professors were Clements and Weaver. Dr. Frederick Clements there in the middle and Dr. John Weaver in the upper right. They were pioneers in advancing basic ecological concepts, the understanding of plant species response to grazing, and theories of plant community succession. And of course, every student of range management, that whether you've gone to Lethbridge College here or studied at the University of Alberta or Saskatchewan, will recognize the little diagram in the lower left-hand corner. And it basically shows the relationship between plants that we call decreasers, increasers, and invaders. the plants that we really want to manage for, the plants that are opportunistic, the plants that are weeds, and how they change on the landscape with grazing pressure. There's Dr. Weaver down having a very close look at the roots in this rangeland setting. Now, this fellow has always been of particular interest to me. This is Arthur Sampson. He's one of my heroes. He's considered the father of range management, and as a student, Sampson was a very strong athlete. He used to make a daily trek up to a local highland to replace the weather charts for a university weather station. And as it turns out, he was a boxer, and he was known as the Utah Kid. But he's also, we consider him to be the father of range management. In 1910, he conducted the first grazing system experiments in Oregon. He developed the concept of spring deferral or providing early rest before grazing would start. And he was the first one to formulate the basic principles of range management. So remember, this is about 1910, before the First War. There he is. And so I remember as a student at the University of Alberta finding this textbook on the shelf. This was the range management textbook, the first one I think that was published in North America. And so one of our inheritances from from Sampson was what we call the principles of rangeland management. These are the sort of the basic things that a rancher would practice to maintain, to balance the needs of livestock with the health of the range, health of the land, balance grazing with the supply through your stocking rates, attend to the season of grazing. I'm going to come back and explain these a little bit later on. Distribution of grazing over the landscape. And you can see we've mirrored those in Alberta. Through my career as an extension specialist, I worked with those. We added, there was originally Sampson had another one, matched the kind and class of livestock. And we rolled that up in the first principle, and then we added another one, provide effective rest after grazing. And this is how I'll conclude. I'll just give you a quick run through to show you that these ideas developed over a century ago are still in common use and are very important today. So now we come to the Canadian prairie. And one of the things that I do here is I'm going to talk about the extirpation of the bison now, and I'm just gonna gloss over that. That's a topic that I think this audience probably knows quite a bit about. But anyway, my purpose tonight is to look at what happened with our grasslands since that time. So we start off with a couple of our early eyewitnesses. We're all, I think, familiar with the Palliser Triangle and Dr. John Palliser, who came through in the 1850s. Palliser, he thought he saw a desert. He cautioned policymakers about what should or should not happen in this landscape. And then 3 decades plus later, along came John McCown. He saw a garden. So we had these sort of conflicting views. But anyway, by 1879, the bison were extirpated from the Canadian prairie. The Dominion of Canada was concerned with trying to promote some form of economic development in the West. And so one of the first things that they undertook was to create grazing leases. And these were grazing opportunities for ranchers. And the idea was to draw in a ranching industry and start to generate income and profit from these landscapes. In the period 1881 to 1910, the policy aimed to attract risk capital, and there were three components to these first grazing leases. First of all, the leases were granted for 21 years, so that would give a ranch a period of economic stability to hold the land. The second thing was that they were required to actually stock these up to capacity within 3 years of being issued, so that these measures were to prevent basically speculation, idle speculation, and just swapping the land. So here's where things went off the rails though. And this reflects probably old world European thinking. The Dominion of Canada set a compulsory stocking rate of 10 acres per head per year. So I'm going to explain that some more. If you don't have if that number doesn't alarm you right now, it does Robert, because he works with that number. He knows about those numbers. So here in Canada, this was kind of the one of the early acts of officially induced error, we might call it. And this policy, what it did is it did not address the inherent differences in productivity of the land. So if we think of the brown soil zone, the lowest moisture area south of Medicine Hat, and contrast that with the mesic, more lush foothill environment, the ability of the land to produce forage is going to be very different between those landscapes. So does everybody remember Time Air and Stub Ross? Okay, well, George Ross, who I guess would be one of Stubb's uncles, was a community leader who recognized that this policy of 10 acres per head per year to sustain a cow, because in those days cattle were often reared year-round on the open range with a little bit of supplementation. He was one of the local leaders in an organization called the Shortgrass Stock Growers Association, and they were later amalgamated into something that you may recognize called the Western Stock Growers that still exists today. And so this is where the ranchers on the land began to raise questions to their elected officials about the state of the range. So the ranching community played a pivotal role in the development of rangeland research by basically asking some of the first research questions. What will this land support? They appeared to be one of the first forums to promote the new and evolving concepts of range management. So some of this knowledge that was being developed south of the border was starting to filter into Canada as well. And so they actually published an early definition, and it's still a pretty darn good definition. The committee defined carrying capacity as the number of cattle which could be grazed in good commercial condition upon the range and preserve the grass with a reasonable carrying capacity over from year to year. And of course, this story that I'm sharing right now comes right out of this old document right here. So here's a representation of this business of acres per animal unit year. The red line represents kind of the official government recommended number. And if I can get my pointer working here. Whoops, wrong one. Here we go. So there's where we start. We're going to try to raise stock a cow on this dry prairie range and carry it on 10 acres per year. That's what these prairie ranchers are trying to do. And so they're starting to push back and they're starting to organize, and already by 8 years later, they've been successful in getting the Dominion of Canada to nudge that number up, so that every time that number rises, it means you're using more land per animal unit. So the stocking rate is getting lighter as that red line rises over time. And so then, whoops. So then we have the next big real crunch that's happening to the prairie rangelands is that the railways have arrived. The prairie sod is being broken. The area of rangeland is starting to decline. We have horses pulling prairie plows. There's a lot of grazing pressure on the remaining rangeland. And the range health, the range condition is deteriorating. And sort of everything sort of comes to a head in the Great Depression. And in fact, in this area, 1927 is a key year for us in our storytelling here. And this shows it another way. I'm just going to skip that because you don't need to all be stocking rate experts tonight. So what happened next? So the ranchers pushed for research to be done to gain an understanding of what the land would sustain. So the Dominion Experimental Farm Service established the first rangeland research program in Canada at One Fort, south of Manyberries, in 1927. And here's, so one of the Hargraves, member of the Hargraves family from Medicine Hat, who's involved in politics and was a scientist as well, said the station was established at the request of the stockmen in 1927 by the Dominion Department of Agriculture in cooperation with the Gilchrist brothers of Wild Horse, Alberta. The research program provided the first scientifically based guidelines on stocking rates and range management practices in the country. So One Fort was the birthplace of range management in Canada. These guys are really important to the story. These are the Gilchrist brothers, and Tom Gilchrist, who I think he just lives up the street from you, Ron, doesn't he now? He used to ranch out at Deer Creek. This is one of the old ranching families, southern Alberta, very, very good stewards of the land. Upper right is Brother Reuben. He's the politician. He's the guy who's working with Ottawa and getting the commitment to set up the experimental farm. We have two brothers, the tall fellows there, top left and center. Joe on the left, Chester in the middle. They don't want to give Canada any excuses not to set up an experimental farm. So they each pony up about 15,000 acres of their lease land. And they say that can go into the experimental farm. And Sandy, the younger brother down below, he was involved in conservation as well. And I think he was actually involved in the introduction of elk back into the Cypress Hills. So now the interesting thing was the politics of the day. Reuben was a liberal. So, different times. Studies began immediately as there was a sense of urgency provided by the ranching community. Upper right is an example of how heavily grazed things were by the late 20s. You can see that those folks are doing some initial measurements on the range, and that is a low-growing short grass, probably dominated by the blue grama grass. Lower left, early studies show that these plant communities, again, were dominated by blue grama. Whoops. My notes here. And then lower right is Dr. Clark, and he also worked with a guy named Dr. Tisdale. Interesting, Dr. Clark was from the University of Nebraska. So our connection back to that institution. One Fort is no longer operated by the federal government. It was returned to the province back in 2013. It's one of the last things I worked on before I retired in 2015. And it is still maintained as a place where there are opportunities to do research, and it's grazed by a local rancher group that are stewards of the land. Yeah, that's the old. It's like a village, and I think that's deeded land, isn't it? Do you know? I'm sorry. No, so I don't know what's happened. I don't know what's happened to that thing, but the surrounding rangeland continues to be grazed and to be managed.
Which way would you be looking there?
You are southeast, yeah, right. Yeah.
So the main road would come in on that angle.
Ron, you've got the best.
Yeah, the main road would be just at the top of the picture.
Okay.
So the over the years, stocking rate studies, grazing systems, the impacts of drought, basic plant ecology studies, livestock production, and regrassing strategies. So roll fast forward to 1938. We've now had a research operation going for about 11 years. And the ranchers they're taking home the lessons, and they're taking those lessons back now to the provincial government, because the land that were federal lands before 1930 are now controlled by the province of Alberta. So in an ongoing attempt, remember, they're coming out of the Dust Bowl too in 1938. In an attempt to address the conservation issues concerned ranchers of the shortgrass stock growers at their annual meeting in 1938, they passed the following resolution. Whereas the cost of grass to leaseholders as charged by the provincial government in rent and taxes heretofore has not been based on the productive value of various range areas. That was their original rub. Therefore, be it resolved that with a view to rating grazing land according to its earning capacity in relation to livestock values based upon investigations and surveys already conducted in the shortgrass area. So they're advocating to take the scientific knowledge and use it to develop better policy. And so in 1945, the province, so this 1941, this is probably the kind of the background information that was gathered together for the policymakers. 1945, the province of Alberta implements grazing lease policy that bases rental and tax rates on carrying capacity and the sale value of livestock. And then further in 1947, results of grazing studies at many berries recommend a carrying capacity value of 50 acres. So over time, as experience continues relative to the climatic cycles as well, that recommended stocking rate is getting lighter and lighter as the more experience is gained in sustaining the grassland. So from here on in the presentation, I'm just going to throw out a few more of these sort of knowledge nuggets of wisdom and just see how they line up with our scientific understanding. Who is A.E. Cross? Alfred Ernest Cross. He was one of the big four, right? Calgary Stampede and all that, and a family with a really good reputation for being stewards of the land. If you take care of the grass, it'll take care of you. So, with this knowledge and changed policies, what happened? What happened on the landscape? So the first and most important principle is this business of stocking rates, and that's about, balancing what the forage that's supplied with the forage that's harvested to produce red meat, right? And one of the early guidelines was to take half and leave half. What we actually see in this really dry southeastern corner, the ranchers themselves, their stocking rates from this 50 acres per head, so going from 10 to 20, 30, 50. If we go and look at what's happened there, say in the last 30 or 40 years, their stocking rates have gotten even lighter. So they're in an average year, they're not even harvesting half of the grass. They may be taking 20 or 30% of it, leaving behind the ungrazed grass to become carryover to protect the roots, the soil, the integrity of the plant community. And here's an interesting thing. So the recognition by the ranchers of the need to manage within sustainable limits, the emerging rangeland science and research, development of range management principles, we see both policies and practices are now supporting rangeland recovery. So the original name describing that dry prairie south of Medicine Hat was shortgrass prairie, shortgrass country. Along in 1950, now we've got three decades or more of recovery taking place. Along comes Robert Copeland. Oh, and by the way, Copeland was a student of John Weaver from the University of Nebraska. Interesting. Weaver observed, as you see in the lower left there, you can see the structure, the growthiness of the prairie is changing as taller growing wheat grasses, needle grasses are starting to overshadow the blue grama grass, displace the blue grama grass, and so that now the prairie has been renamed as mixed grass prairie, and that's a reflection of recovery. So here's kind of the recap of our phases. That first phase, the first box on the left, advent of ranching, and then in the middle section we see the depredation of the rangeland through the Dust Bowl years, and then adaptive range management taking place beyond that, and we see the recovery. Those other lines are actual stocking rates that I pulled from ranches in this 1-4 area, and just to show that those are actual real world examples of what ranchers were stocking the grasslands at. Let's talk about roots. The old stockman says, if you keep down the shoot, you kill the root. And of course, that takes us back to Dr. Weaver, who's down there in that soil pit looking at. If any of you have been watching some of the dramatic stuff that's been happening in Ukraine, there are numerous examples where images in the trenches are being are visible in the footage. And Ron, you've probably seen that. And what sort of profile depths are we? Some of them are deep profiles, aren't they? Very deep. Yes, and the name of the technical name for naming those grassland soils is Chernozem, and that name originates from that part of the world where similar soils have developed. Anyway, so another location, we're just going to gloss over this here, but another location that was established by Agriculture Canada was the Stavely substation, west of the town of Stavely. It was established by Alec Johnson in 1949 at the recommendation of the Western Stock Growers. And I can't show you, really illustrate all the details here, but the famous photograph of Alex is there where he grew rough fescue plants out in a sand medium. And then he subjected those plants to increasing levels and frequencies of clipping. And you can see the plant sample there that's the furthest right that just has the little tufts of roots left. That is the result of a plant being grazed intensely, repeatedly. So that's a really graphic representation of what happens with overgrazing. Then when the soil, when we change the plant community, we perhaps change the amount of organic matter that's going into the soil. We make the soil more vulnerable to wind and water erosion. You can see what's happened. The soil above is an intact, healthy soil profile, deep black Chernozem. Down below, the soil color is actually changed to what we'd see in a drier environmental region as the site has been degraded. Now, this was done under experimental conditions, and it's a powerful, a really powerful illustration of how grazing practices can maintain the system. In fast forward to today, there's a tremendous amount of interest in our native grasslands and in the amount of soil organic carbon that they store. There's this graphic here. These are just some rough numbers that came out of a study, and I'm sure that these estimates are probably being more refined over time. But what's really interesting, we see down in the dry mixed grass, so that would be the brown soil zone, our driest grassland in the southeast. Here at Lethbridge, we sit in the mixed grass, which is dark brown soil. The foothills fescue to the west are black soils. And you can see the different amounts of tons per hectare of soil organic carbon And it's really interesting to note that some of our best grassland may actually store more carbon than say a boreal forest site. And one of the interesting things about grasslands is when they burn, a lot of that carbon remains beneath the soil surface, whereas in a forest fire, a lot of that is lost to the atmosphere. So there's a tremendous interest right now in this whole aspect of rangeland roots and the sequestration and storage of soil organic carbon and the interaction that has with our climate cycle. Give you one more example here as how am I doing for time? Good, okay. The old stockman said, and I keep referring back to the old stockman because very often the old stockmen were a few steps ahead of the scientists. The scientists could come along and explain why it worked, but often they had observed how things worked just through their interaction with their livestock and the landscape. And the old stockman said, it takes grass to make grass. And this is what I think, this is a little graphic that Dr. Walter Wilms created. Walter Wilms was the range scientist that took over from Alex when Alex retired from Agriculture Canada. And here we have a little rangeland, grassland plant community here. And it has no mulch or litter. Remember I said the ungrazed stuff that's left behind to weather and break down. And this mulch has this protective insulating effect on the soil surface, and it helps moisture infiltration. So here, if we have enough litter, that litter will actually have a measurable impact on the benefit to the productivity of that site. You'll have more evaporation, more moisture lost. Where you have no litter, where you have adequate litter, then you have reduced moisture loss, and you'll have an increase in productivity. We, in my time in Southern Alberta, I came from Central Alberta, and I really didn't know about drought the way people in Southern Alberta do. So I had to get up to speed. But it was really interesting to watch in the severe drought that we had 1999, 2000, 2001, that most of you will remember. That really shut down the productivity of our rangelands. But it was quite interesting to see in this area of this Medicine Hat area in particular, where really the driest part of the province, where people really had this understanding of drought built into how they managed the land. When they saw the early signs of drought, they would reduce their stocking levels, often, marketing animals early. And they had a variety of different strategies that they would use to take the pressure off their grassland so that when the moisture returned, the grassland could recover. And so just as I wrap up this part of it, I'll just do a really quick run through the 4 principles of range management. Are they relevant today? My rhetorical question. So when we balance livestock needs with the available forage supply, the first and most important principle of range management, that's this image from the Waldron Ranch along Highway 22, is a good illustration. You can see that you cannot get those cattle to graze that landscape perfectly evenly. It'll have that ragged appearance, but you can see that their red meat is being produced there, but there's residue is being left behind to protect plants and soil. And so we have to recognize that we can't use it all. Livestock will use a portion. Other critters on the range will need a portion of it. Wildlife, insects will use it. And we need to leave enough behind to protect the plant itself. And this graphic here just makes the point about that carryover that becomes litter and has that important moisture conservation influence. And one of the things that cattlemen had to do is as with crossbreeding programs, cattle have generally gotten bigger over the years. Cattle were much smaller frame size, a century ago. And so bigger cows need more grass. And so you have to adjust for that. And then we've become much more conscious of our riparian areas. And so leaving residue behind is really important to trap sediment and maintain stream banks, stream function. Here's just an illustration of different levels depending on how this grassland has been stocked over the years. You can see a healthy northern and western wheatgrass plant community up top. This would be very typical of the plant communities we would find right here at Lethbridge on some of our grassland soils. In the middle one is starting to show some stress, where the wheat grasses are starting to decline. They're the decreasers. The needle and thread is an increaser. It's a little more abundant. Still a pretty good standard grass, but health is declining. And then down below, we're starting to get really grazing resistant increasers, maybe a few invaders as well. So this is kind of the structure that people like Robert would use in the lens that he works with his ranchers in terms of looking at their grasslands and seeing if they need to make some adjustments to their management. So healthy with problems and unhealthy. Second principle. This initially, this principle was concerned with the season of grazing. If we're always grazing our plants early in the season, this is very stressful for them. There's a concept of range readiness that has developed, that we need to allow range plants to get their photosynthetic area up and to replenish their root reserves before they're ready to be grazed. And so this concept of deferred grazing that Samson championed early on was based on this concept. And part of spring grazing impact can also be to do with the removal of litter and drying out the site as well. So we try to avoid that. Critical rest periods may be different in other community types. In riparian areas, a critical time may actually be in the fall. Livestock will often move into riparian areas and graze the woody plants in the fall because they'll still have a high protein level, and so there may be other times of vulnerability as well. Then we get into the third principle of range management, distributing livestock evenly. And this is a creative process. It'll be different for every farming and ranching operation. And it involves the observing how your animals are using the landscape, and then using watering locations, salting locations, perhaps herding practices, that sort of thing. There's even some high-tech stuff developing now, where basically electronic fences are being developed with high-tech gadgetry that will control how animals will move on the landscape as well, without physical fences. There's a study down in Miles City, south of the border, showing sometimes you have to overcome certain behavioral aspects of your cattle. There's one type of cow there called a hill climber, and the other one is a bottom dweller. And so you're trying to overcome the habits of the bottom dweller with your management. But it takes observation. Now, water is one of the interesting tools that Agriculture Canada has worked on, and has a really powerful influence in pulling animals away from things like sensitive riparian areas. But not all patchiness is bad, because historically, in the way the bison grazed, there would have been a natural patchiness to the landscape. And this graphic here just shows that prairie birds, for example, some of them like tall, uniform grassland, others like really low growing, heavily grazed grassland, and most of them like something in between. So patchiness, we call that structural diversity, and that can be very beneficial to some of the wildlife species that we're trying to manage for as well. The last principle here is to provide effective rest after grazing. And this is where, in the early days, the focus was on stocking rates, but through time, once again, imitating how the bison grazed, Ranchers have learned to use rotational grazing practices to provide periods of grazing and rest, changing the pattern sequence of how pastures are used through a growing season. And this can have a tremendous influence on maintaining the health of the range. Here's a simple example of just one simple fence through that field, creating a 2-field switchback, has enabled this grazing association to recover this little stream from what they had on the left, which is very overgrazed, to a healthy recovered stream condition on the right. And this is kind of my last slide here, putting principles into practice. And every farm and ranch is unique, and so the principles and practices won't be the same everywhere. They'll really depend on what you have to work with and what your management objectives are. Last couple slides I'll show you here. So this takes us back to our remaining native prairie. And what's really interesting are these grazing leases have actually been quite an important conservation tool for over 100 years. Now, if I show you this actually shows you the distribution of grazing leases that exist today. And you can see that it lines up quite well with these large blocks of native prairie that are remaining. So we really rely upon the province's policies and the way that they work with the ranching community to deliver stewardship. These dispositions, arguably, they maintain more biodiversity than a relatively limited number of parks do.
Do they not let, cattle go in the British block or we have?
There, portions of the British bloc are grazed, yes, yeah. But it would be, it's probably maybe only 15 or 20%, something like that. Yeah. Yeah, so that is that's my message. So thank you.